All right, it looks like we have a good group of people in, so I can go ahead and kick us off. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Improving Student Learning at Scale author webinar. My name is Iris Swaney, and I am the editorial project manager for Stylus Publishing. Stylus webinars bring you direct access to our authors and their latest titles. Today, I'm happy to introduce Keston Fulcher and Caroline Prendergast, the co-authors of Improving Student Learning at Scale, a how-to guide for higher education, published this June. Keston Fulcher is the Executive Director of the Center of Assessment and Research Studies and Professor in Graduate Psychology at James Madison University, and his research focuses on structuring higher education for learning improvement. Caroline Prendergast is completing her PhD in Assessment and Measurement, also at James Madison University. She has 6 years of experience in educational assessment, ranging from international large-scale assessment to work with small student affairs programs in higher ed. Their book, Improving Student Learning at Scale, is a step-by-step guide for improving student learning in higher ed by implementing at-scale improvement efforts that span an entire program, affecting all affiliated students. So let's welcome Keston and Caroline.
All right. Iris, thank you so much for that introduction, everybody. It is great to be here. One of the first questions you might ask is, who is this book for? It's basically for anybody who is interested in improving student learning beyond the individual course section level. And we can break that out a little bit. So you might be a faculty member who has done a great job at teaching your own section. So you have the pedagogy, the curriculum, the assessment all aligned, but you're looking around you and the other sections of the course and the courses before yours and after yours aren't as aligned as they could be. So how can you work with your colleagues to make learning better across different sections, across courses? You might be an assessment expert like myself and like Caroline, and you may have done a lot of good assessment work, gotten a lot of good data, but then nobody's using that data for changes or for improvement. So you might be thinking about, how can my assessment fit with a program's efforts to improve? You could be a faculty developer and you've worked with a lot of different faculty on course design or course redesign, but your efforts are typically working with individual faculty at their individual section level, and you're not developing the faculty as a group to improve student learning at the program level or beyond. Last, you might be an administrator who may have big ideas with your colleagues about how you can shape learning across the college that you work in, yet you're not quite sure about the strategy to move people forward. So the book might be for you too. So in the next 45 minutes or so, Caroline and I are going to take you on a little path. Caroline is going to give you the background about learning improvement, and then I want to get specifically into the book and talk about the 6 steps that we highlight in the book for learning improvement. And then finally, we will talk about Q&A for just a moment. But before all those things, I want to give you a little backstory about how I got into learning improvement at scale. So let's go way back to the early 2000s. I was a very new assessment professional, and I'd been invited to this really big meeting, and it's at SHEV, that's the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia, and there's this new policy on assessment for the Commonwealth. And so around this big table, there are some assessment people like me. We're sort of the low people on the totem pole. You have representatives from the state council, and you also have these high-level administrators. So we had several provosts who were also sitting around the table. And this discussion was lively because we're talking about the new policy. And frankly, there were a lot of institutions that weren't too keen on this new assessment policy because it was a little bit more aggressive in terms of what different schools were supposed to report on assessment. So people were talking, it's loud, there's some argument going on. And then I remember this one gentleman raised his hand and he said, "Is it okay if I speak? I've got a story to tell." As everybody kind of looks at him, sure. So the room is quiet and we direct our attention towards him. Just for context, he looks a little bit like Ichabod Crane. So he's a really skinny guy. He's got glasses, he's got a bow tie, and really nerdy, but at the same time has that sort of academic cockiness that only a few people possess. So all attention was on him. And he says, "Well, I come from an agricultural background, and we used to have a saying, a pig never fattened because it was weighed." And he said, "When I think about assessment, I think about it the same way. Students never learn more just because they're assessed." And everybody just starts cracking up because his delivery was just amazing. Everybody's laughing, yep, and it was a good point. And there I am, I got this goofy grin on my face, but at the same time, I'm thinking about it, and this is sort of disastrous from an assessment perspective, right? So I've been taught that assessment should be focused on learning improvement, but here he's making this case about a pig never fattened because it was weighed, or students never learned more because they were assessed. And that just stuck with me. And have you ever been in that position where somebody throws an insult at you and you don't come up with a comeback until maybe 5 minutes later, maybe an hour or a month or two later, and by that time it's too late? Well, in this case, I was actually able to come up with a comeback, but it was 10 years after that fact, but it might be useful to us today. So I came back from that meeting, about 10 years roll by. At this point, I'm now back at James Madison University, and I've been working with some graduate students, and we're thinking about that relationship between assessment and learning improvement. And that saying came back, a pig never fattened because it was weighed. And I just remembered how much that affected me and how I needed to have a good response to it. And so these graduate students and I are talking, and we thought, well, what's missing? Like, what would make a pig fatter? Well, you'd have to feed it, right? Either feed it more or something more nutritious to make that pig fatter. And so then we're kind of chatting. We thought, well, what would it look like if, assessment was in part of an improvement process? So we were like, well, it's maybe assess and then intervene and then reassess. Or from the pig perspective, it's weigh pig, feed pig, then weigh pig again. Assess, intervene, and reassess. And that's where we came up with the simple model for learning improvement. Now, as time went by, Caroline and I realized that there's a lot more than improvement than just that simple model: assess, intervene, and reassess. At this point, Caroline is going to give you a little bit more background about improvement. So Caroline, I'm going to pass the mic off to you.
Thank you, Keston. Well, hello, everybody. I'm Caroline Prendergast. It's wonderful to be with you all today. It's really nice to see some familiar names in the attendee list here. So hi, everybody. All right. So what Keston was kind of referring to here is this idea that we have sort of an implicit logic model for assessment. So we have ways that we've been taught assessment is supposed to lead to student learning. So we think that if we have better information about student learning, whether that's more information or higher quality information or the right kinds of information at the right times, if we have better information, that's going to lead us to having better informed pedagogical strategies. If we know what students are missing, we're going to be able to tailor their educational experiences so that they get those things that they're missing. If we know what they're strong in, then we know that we can build off of those things. And then if we're able to do that, if we're able to tailor the way that we are instructing our students, that's going to lead to better and more student learning, right? This is kind of the implicit idea behind what we do in assessment in higher education. That said, we don't have a whole lot of evidence that this is actually what happens. So let's unpack this a little bit. About a decade and a half ago, Trudy Bonta and some of her colleagues set out to figure out whether or not this is actually what was going on at universities across the country. So they set out to gather assessment reports from a bunch of different universities, and they asked universities to submit their best possible examples of best practices in assessment. So reports that demonstrated the highest quality assessment that those universities had to offer. So they ended up with 146 assessment reports that were submitted by all these different colleges and universities. Now I want you to think to yourself, how many of those 146 assessment reports do you think demonstrated improved student learning? You can throw it in the chat if you want, or you can just think to yourself, but just take a second. Out of those 146, how many do you think demonstrated improved student learning?
And Carol, I'm looking at the attendee list. There may be a few people who know the answer. If you actually know the answer, refrain from putting it in the chat, but you can sort of laugh behind the scenes because you know what the answer is.
That's probably quite true. All right, so it was only 9 out of those 146. So about 6% of those reports actually demonstrated improved student learning. So that's throwing quite a wrench into our logic model, right? If these are examples of the best possible assessment practice, we would probably assume that more than 6% of them would be able to demonstrate improved student learning, but that wasn't the case. So digging a little bit more into what was going on, What they found and what people have found since is that a lot of colleges and universities have gotten way better over the years at using multiple measures to assess student learning outcomes, at increasing the quality of those measures, increasing the quality of the analyses that they're conducting based on the data that they collect from those measures. But they're missing some key steps. So first, they're not closing the loop, as we'll often refer to it. So they're not using the information that they gathered from those assessment tools in order to intentionally modify their policy or their practice. So they're not changing the curriculum, they're not changing the way that their universities are structured in response to the information that they're collecting, even though they're collecting that information and that information tends to be of higher quality than it used to be. And they also couldn't identify ways in which assessment was actually resulting in changes that are linked to improved student learning. So again, going back to that logic model, what we expect to be happening as we move from assessment to student learning, it's breaking down somewhere. So this is a problem, right? We're spending a lot more time and money and energy on assessment now than we ever did in the past. And we've reached a point where it's really clear that assessment isn't just sort of a fad that's going to go away. But if we don't have the thing to show for it that we thought we would, so evidence of improved student learning, then it should make us question whether we're approaching this the right way. And so that's exactly what we started doing here at JMU. So if access to high quality data isn't the problem, then what is? So maybe the problem is the way that we're framing this question. So if we take an assessment frame to this problem, we could say, okay, well, how can we collect better and more data? That's kind of the assessment-centric way to think about this problem. And as assessment professionals, this is kind of the way that we're often trained to think about this problem is if we can just get the right data into the right hands at the right time, it's going to solve this problem. But there's another way that we could think about this, and this is the learning improvement frame. What that says is how can we better integrate the components of the learning system in order to increase the likelihood that student learning will improve? And this is a completely different way of thinking about this problem. This is the way that we started approaching the problem here at JMU. So our question shifted. So not how can we increase the amount of data or the kinds of data that people are getting, but how can we better integrate the tools that we have available on our campus? So we began to strengthen our partnerships with our Campus Center for Faculty Innovation, and we began talking to different programs about how exactly they wanted to see their students improve. And then we worked to develop a paradigm that would help guide programs through the process of improved student learning while maximizing those relationships. So this leads us to the simple model for learning improvement that Keston alluded to at the beginning of this presentation. So there's 3 steps to this model: assess, intervene, and reassess. So as a first step, programs needed to be able to measure student learning. So that's that basic assessment component that we've already talked about has gotten much stronger over the last couple of decades across the country. So prior to implementing any sort of changes to the curriculum, we have to measure students' knowledge, skills, and abilities upon graduating from or finishing the program that they're working in. And the important thing is that we're doing this before we make any sort of changes to that program. We're measuring the program as it currently exists. This provides us with a benchmark that we can use to compare to later measurements. The second step in this model, and arguably the most important step, the one that we weren't thinking enough about, involves implementing theoretically sound interventions, changes to curricular strategies and pedagogical strategies. So in other words, we have to change what our focus is here on these interventions. So we have to change what it is that students are experiencing. This is the thing that is going to actually result in changes to student learning. So importantly, this step can't just be left up to a couple of intrepid faculty members. This has to be something that occurs across an entire program. So what I mean here is that we're not going to count on a couple of faculty members having questions about their course and working through a course redesign process. What we're talking about are coordinated interventions that reach across, say, the entire psychology major or the entire statistics minor, where there are changes being made in order to alter the student's entire experience, regardless of which classes they end up taking, which individual faculty members they end up enrolling with. The final step of this process is to reassess the program after a new cohort of students has had the opportunity to go through and experience that new set of interventions, those changes that were made to the curriculum. So it's really important too that the data are collected as similarly as possible to that initial assessment that we took before that intervention. And this is going to allow us to compare our two cohorts of students. So if we've actually improved student learning, we should see more favorable assessment results under this new curriculum during this reassessment than we saw under the initial assessment prior to the interventions. So anyone in this Zoom room who has some measurement chops or some assessment chops knows that I am oversimplifying this quite a bit. But the point here is that we need to compare what we're seeing in our new program after we've made some alterations to what we saw originally. And only if we're seeing more favorable results in that reassessment can we say that improvement has actually occurred. So let's look at an example of what this might look like. So let's say we have our entering class of 2021. And we want to measure their ethical reasoning abilities because we think that this is something really important that students need to have by the time that they graduate. So we give them a measure of ethical reasoning after they go through the curriculum, and we find that they have an average ethical reasoning score of 2.5. And let's say that that's not the kind of score that we were looking for. Let's say that that's lower than we want it to be. So we set forth on a learning improvement initiative, and we implement some new ethical reasoning programming. We change the way that students are encountering this content. So maybe they're experiencing new things in their courses, maybe there's new co-curricular experiences, maybe we change the way that we approach orientation for first-year students. At this point, this is only a change. We don't know that this is an improvement because we don't know whether this is going to lead to an improved amount of student learning. We don't know whether it's going to result in more favorable scores on this measure of ethical reasoning. So now let's say that we wait for the class of 2024, they've experienced this whole new set of interventions, and we assess them, and we find that they have an average ethical reasoning score of a 3.5. And let's say that's more in line with what we were hoping to see. So this is a more favorable score. At this point, we can say that this change actually is an improvement. So this is what we mean when we say assess, intervene, reassess. We're comparing these two cohorts of students to see whether students learn more under this new curriculum than they did under the original curriculum. Something important that you'll hear us mention throughout this webinar and that you'll see prominently displayed on the cover of our book is this idea of this happening at scale. So what we mean by at scale is that this isn't just happening in individual isolated pockets of our university. It's happening across an entire program. So that might be an academic major, it might be the general education curriculum, some sort of intentional group of experiences. So this is often called in the writing that we've done here at the Center for Assessment and Research Studies as, it's usually referred to as the level problem. So faculty development traditionally has sort of focused on individual faculty members. So faculty would have to seek out the opportunity to redesign their course, to make changes to the way that they're teaching something. And faculty do this all the time. They reflect on the ways in which they're teaching things, whether or not students were getting these key concepts. This happens all the time, but it happens on an individual level. The problem, though, is then exposure to improvement depends entirely on the classes that a student takes, if they ended up in the courses taught by the faculty members who were engaging in this process. And if all those faculty are focusing on completely different things when they're going through that process of course redesign, then we're never going to see program level improvement. Learning improvement at scale takes an entirely different approach. So here we're going to have these improvement initiatives that span an entire academic program. They're going to require more coordination across multiple faculty members, which makes things a little bit tricky, but they then have the capability to impact all of the students who are enrolled in a program. And we think that this is a more effective way to approach this problem. However, the real world is obviously more complex, and navigating the requirements to do something like this at scale is a little bit tricky, which is why we wrote our book. So Keston's going to talk to us a little bit now about the 6-step model that we outline in our book.
All right. Thanks so much, Caroline. Yeah, so a little insight here. Over the last 10 years, I've been fortunate enough to work with a lot of faculty, some faculty developers, some grad students to roll up our sleeves and actually get under the hood of programs to figure out how to improve student learning at scale. In the past, geez, Caroline, I think it's about 3.5 years now that we started to work together. We've done the same, exploring different programs and how to improve them. And one thing that I wish I had at the very beginning of that process was kind of a roadmap about how would you go about doing this. And I couldn't find it in the sort of traditional assessment books that I was reading. And so we've thought carefully about how do we lay out those steps. And we boiled it down into 6 steps. And we have these 6 questions that correspond to the different steps. So the steps in a way answer particular questions. So let's talk about that first step, Caroline. Okay, so here's the overview of the 6 processes. And the first is the will to improve. So is there a critical mass of faculty or student affairs professionals in a program that want to improve? So recall that the simple model is assess, intervene, and reassess. But before that first assessment, there's a lot of work to be done in trying to get the hearts and the minds of the different faculty who are in a program, the folks who are actually going to deliver the new interventions. If they don't want to do anything, it's going to be really hard for there to be improvement. In fact, it's going to be sort of dead on arrival. There's no way that improvement effort is going to work if people aren't invested in it. And so that part of the book focuses on, how do you talk with faculty? How do you figure out what they may want to improve? So the next particular step is, if there is this will to improve, to clarify that vision of what improved student learning looks like. And so many of you all may have heard that concept of backwards design. So beginning with the end in mind, what would it look like if students were really good at a particular skill? But it has to be in quite a bit of detail. For example, the skill that Caroline talked about earlier, ethical reasoning. Most people will say, yeah, ethical reasoning, that's super important. We want all our students to be good at ethical reasoning skills. But then you ask them, what do you mean by ethical reasoning? And most of them are scratching their head, or the ones who aren't scratching their head are giving you very different definitions of what they think ethical reasoning is. So it's having this sort of collective vision of a very concrete way of looking at something like ethical reasoning skills. And that's a pretty tough journey, but you have to have that in order to get to the next components. And so the next particular question is, with respect to that vision that we talked about, that clear vision of, let's say, ethical reasoning, like where are we now in the program? And traditionally, the way that assessment folks have looked at that component is that they will look at the student learning outcomes. That is kind of sort of the measure of where students are. And they'll say, oh yeah, well, students right now on a scale from 0 to 4 at a 2.5 on ethical reasoning. Okay, that's really good information to have. That tells you sort of where the student proficiency is. But the other component to that is, well, what's the structure that is in place right now that 2.5 comes from? So it's like there's a certain program in place that produces those 2.5s. And if you only know what the outcomes are, but you don't know what the program is, then it gets pretty tough to figure out, like, why are we getting the results that we're currently getting? So it's investigating both that learning environment and investigating those outcomes. That's the where are we now. Once you get to that point, the next piece is the intervention. So in this stage 4, what interventions could move the program from the current state to the vision? What evidence do we have that these interventions might be effective? And so at this point, we've got a good understanding of the program, and we're trying to figure out, what can we do? How can we change the learning environment to hopefully get us to that vision of better ethical reasoning skills? Well, it turns out that there's quite a bit of literature on a number of different areas regarding interventions. Some are general, they're like learning theory. So it's basically basic stuff about how students learn better. And this can be applied across multiple programs. And then there's a more specific, the more discipline specific, related to certain things. So for example, critical thinking may look different in philosophy than it does in communication. So you may want to look in those specific discipline literatures to look at those pieces. The idea here is that a lot of these skills are really complicated. And if you were starting from scratch and you had to reinvent the wheel, oh my gosh, it would take so much time by just trial and error to figure out what works. So we think that a good first step is really pouring into literature and then adapting that into your own home environment. So that brings us to the next piece, and that is, how will we ensure that the interventions will be delivered as expected? Some of y'all know in the audience that this is referring to implementation fidelity. So oftentimes in programs, they may have laid out a curriculum map that on paper that these particular interventions will happen in these courses. But guess what? Sometimes what's on paper doesn't actually equate to what's happening in the classroom. In fact, there's a lot of different sectors out there in society beyond higher education. So this is K through 12, this is healthcare, this is business, where they realize that there's a real fidelity problem. So it could be the case where you've chosen good interventions, but they just haven't been followed or done as you have it on paper. So that's that idea too, that we think that implementation is so important that it should be its separate step. And then that brings us to the last step, and that is, what is the assessment strategy to determine whether the learning improvement project is effective? So we've got these interventions, we deliver those interventions, and now we have to think about, well, how effective are they? Well, we have to have that last reassessment component in the process. And I always think about it this way. Wouldn't it be so sad if you went through all the other steps in the process of learning improvement at scale, and then you didn't do the reassessment at the end? It's kind of like training up for a marathon, crossing that finish line, and we're like, was my time faster than it was before? If you don't have that time, or you don't have that reweighing, or you don't have that reassessment at the end, then it's impossible to know if you just made changes or if the changes actually resulted in learning improvement at scale. And that brings me back to the last point. I hinted at this a little bit, but this learning improvement at scale, these 6 steps, aren't that different from the original model. So Caroline, can you put those up there? Right. So the 3rd step in the 6-step process is actually that original assessment, that where are we now? And remember, those 2 steps ahead of it are so important too, because if you don't have those 2 components, then it doesn't really matter what you assess ahead of time, because it's likely not going to lead into improvement. And then we broke out the intervene into 2 pieces. So the first is, selecting or choosing interventions that have been shown to work in the literature. And you have to break it out a little bit and talk about the implementation too. So in real life, how were those interventions actually implemented? Of course, the piece is actually the same for both the simple model and the 6-step process for learning improvement at scale, is that reassessment component. Okay. So, laid it out. It's like, oh yeah, six steps, Keston and Caroline, that seems pretty simple. We'll just follow those and it's going to be great. Let me tell you, it's certainly possible to do learning improvement at scale, but we've had some big successes and we've had some, I would say, sort of, mild successes too, but we've learned, and some failures, and we've learned across the way. So let me give you an example of something that I didn't realize was a learning improvement scale attempt that didn't go well. And this was many years ago. So I was working closely with a particular institution, and what they wanted to do was improve students' critical thinking skills through a first-year seminar course. So here's some things that this particular institution did really well. They actually got the will to improve very well. So they had all the faculty who taught the first-year seminars talking about what students needed. They all agreed that critical thinking was something that they wanted students to know they could do once they finished that first-year seminar. And they had also worked on a definition of critical thinking that they could all buy into. So the vision was pretty tight. So let me stop there. That's pretty awesome, right? Oftentimes we don't even get to that part, but they did those preliminary steps pretty well. They even did the first assessment pretty well. So they got a test that they vetted, they chose it, tested students, and students weren't doing too well at the beginning point. Well, they shouldn't, because we were trying to do a learning improvement at scale. So then to the next step, okay, what are we going to do in order to teach critical thinking skills better so that ultimately students will learn more about critical thinking? So the thought was, we'll get this professional, this person who's a professional in critical thinking, we'll have her come to campus and provide a 3-hour workshop on critical thinking. Most of the faculty, by the way, have very little experience with teaching critical thinking. So this expert comes in, 3-hour workshop, and then Caroline, going back to the logic model was, therefore, faculty will go and they will take that information they learned in that 3-hour workshop, they will overhaul their course, and voila, new learning environment. Students are going to come out of it with great critical thinking. Well, guess what happened? Actually, talk to me in the chat, y'all. What happened? Do you think something awesome happened there? Julie said, not with that setup. And she's got a big smiley face on there. Workshops happen, the minimal changes to courses. That's what Nicholas says. They cannot change the curriculum by themselves. They needed some more support. That's from Monica Stidberg, whoever that might be. I'm joking. I know Monica very well. All right. Well, yeah, y'all are right on. And so, here's the thing. As we sort of thought through it, the post-mortem of a doomed learning improvement at a scale, is that, gosh, first of all, you're assuming that the faculty are going to learn how to, learn the concepts in critical thinking in 3 hours. And then they're going to take their current curriculum and they're going to be able to shape that. I mean, gosh, to me, that seems like we messed up the training, the space and time component by an order of at least 2 magnitudes, right? I mean, this is probably, or, it's maybe 100 hours worth of time, at least 50, and we only had for 3. And so that was the issue, is that we certainly didn't give faculty enough space and time to get hold of the material, and certainly not enough time to rethink about their curriculum and change that. Okay, and so now this might go, I want to kind of throw this back to you, okay? I know many of you all have been in higher education for quite some time, and I'm curious about what you have experienced. Can you think of a situation where the intention was this learning improvement at scale, but it sort of fell apart? And so, Caroline, if you kind of roll those real quick. So here's a couple of ways that it can be done, and I want to hear what your opinion is, but it could be that the program is poorly designed. It could be that it's too weak. It could have inadequate support. Write what your experiences was or were in the chat box. Aaron was like, you know what, you should have put on that multiple choice item, you should have put an E for all of the above. Sylvia says transfers. Hey, Sylvia, I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. So maybe give us a sentence explanation there. Monica saying challenging getting all the key faculty to agree. So yeah, so my example was a failure in intervention, basically. Monica's saying, hey, didn't have people on board at the very beginning. That will to improve was not there. Okay. Inconsistent implementation. Another person commented that maybe the students weren't on board, didn't quite understand what the project was about. Not enough feedback, sure. Faculty who didn't think they needed to intervene, sure. But, by the way, if you can consistently deliver the same program, why would you think that student learning is going to improve from one cohort to the next? They were not self-directed learners, okay? Yeah, instructors were expected to completely revise a program without funding, compensation, or course releases to do the work. Yeah, that's a big theme that Caroline and I talked about a lot, sort of space and time to work on an improvement effort. Yeah, the follow through, that's Dan, yes. Aaron commenting on Dan. Oh, Rebecca, yes. Too many improvement plans happening at once. Gosh, this is something I have a pet peeve about, and it's sort of this, I think, incorrect notion of what continuous improvement means. But oftentimes when people have their assessment report, for every single student learning outcome is like, how are you going to improve the program for each one of those every year? It's hard to see improvement in one area across a 10-year space, let alone, every area, every year, impossible. Was a student learning center involved? Yeah, maybe there's partners on campus that could lend their expertise to make better learning systems, and they weren't involved. Oh, yes. There's Kelsey. Yeah, she's exactly right. It was like, hey, y'all, we made these big changes, and then we did this assessment, and students are looking great. And then you're thinking back, oh, no, we didn't do an original assessment. So it's impossible to tell how much better this newer cohort is that got this new program than the older cohort. Yeah, and Kelsey liked that explanation so much, you put an extra S on that. Yes, yes. Yeah, maybe the faculty didn't understand that change did not equal improvement. By the way, Sharon, there's no shame in that. By the way, up till maybe 2012, I was using those terms basically interchangeably. I would say improvement when in actuality it was a change. And so that's something I think as a field, we've been a little bit better at distinguishing those things. Yeah, Scott, you're right on. Changing leadership resulted in loss of intervention support. I think many colleges go through this. It could be, learning improvement effort, or it could be other types of initiatives on campus that they have a lot of momentum, and then a high-level administrator like a provost, a VP, or maybe the president changes, and then that initiative sort of gets in the shade, and there's another initiative that pops up. And oftentimes, to be successful, these initiatives need several years of planning and action behind them. Okay, this is great. Thanks so much. I love this chat. Great information there. Okay, Caroline, what's next?
So I had prepared some sort of common solutions for some of these questions, and I'm both surprised by how many of them are actually addressed in the comments, and also really surprised and delighted by how many I have not addressed here that you talked about in the chat. So I'm just going to run through some of the advice that we give in the book about ways that we can try to avoid some of these problems. So the first one, and this came up in the chat just a couple of notes ago, is not to overextend. So it's really important just to focus on one really well-defined objective. And it's true too that we have a limited amount of resources at all times, and within a given program or within a given university, it probably makes more sense to have a small number of these initiatives going at once so that we can give them adequate time and support. So things like course releases or faculty development stipends over the summer, those kinds of support are necessary in order for us to actually pull something like this off. And we just can't do this with a million things at once. We need to be focusing in on something that's really well defined and giving it the resources it deserves. That's going to be more successful than kind of going halfway on a bunch of different things. Another important step is to commit. So methods and measures don't have to be absolutely perfect in order for us to do something like this, but they do need to be good enough that we're willing to sort of freeze them. So there's a project that I'm working on right now with our general education program here at JMU. So we're working on students' rhetorical analysis skills in our first year writing course. And so that meant that we had to develop a way to measure rhetorical analysis skills and a way to teach rhetorical analysis skills. And those are not easy things to measure or teach. They're pretty complicated. And if we wanted to get the perfect measure or the perfect intervention for that topic area, it would take us years. We'd probably never get to the point where all 46 faculty who are teaching these classes agree that, yes, this is exactly the way I want this measure to be, or this is exactly the way that I want these interventions to be. But we could get to a point where everybody said, yeah, I can live with that. I think that this is reasonable. I think that this measure is going to give me useful information. I'd probably tweak it a little bit if it was in my class or if I was in control, but this seems reasonable. It's really important that we get to that stage with learning improvement efforts so that they don't stall before we get the chance to actually do anything. And this can be really difficult to do. Something else that we've talked a little bit about throughout this presentation is the importance of using the literature. So that goes both for figuring out how to measure the things that we're working on, as well as how to teach them. So Keston talked about this a little bit earlier, but this includes both kind of the general literature on learning, how students learn, how students retain information, how best to teach different kinds of knowledge and skills. But it also goes for specific disciplines. So I come out of a psychology program. Psychology as a discipline has a really rich tradition of scholarship of teaching and learning. And so what that means is there's a ton of information, journal articles, conference presentations, books about how to teach the kinds of things that we might focus a learning improvement initiative on. And we can use that information, and we should use that information, because we don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. There are going to be times that we strike out and we don't find quite as much information in the literature about the thing that we're trying to improve. But most of the time, there's going to be something relevant out there, even if it's kind of general information, like information from the cognitive sciences, the learning sciences, that will help us develop more effective interventions. And so I think sometimes there's kind of this view that using those resources is in some way like cheating or taking a shortcut, but it is one of the best things that we can do to make our efforts more successful and more economical. The way that we can quickly move into creating an effective intervention is by looking at what's been done before, what's worked, and what hasn't, and why. Finally, partnerships matter. Partnerships matter so much when we do these things. So like I was saying before, the project that I'm working on right now with our first year writing program has benefited greatly from the fact that the people in that program, a lot of them have shown up to workshops that we've facilitated. A lot of them know how to talk a little bit of assessment. I know how to talk a little bit of their language because I happen to have a bachelor's degree in writing. So having those kinds of connections, having those partnerships, being able to talk to people and speak a little bit of their language while they're learning how to speak yours is really important in kind of building that trust and collaboration that's necessary for a learning improvement initiative. So often when we're kind of starting our first couple of learning improvement initiatives, it makes the most sense to work with those programs where you're going to be able to have those effective partnerships quickly. So that can be another really useful place to start, is thinking about who your allies are on campus, who you already have good relationships with, and seeing if you can build something there. All right, so with all of that in mind, Keston's going to wrap us up by talking a little bit about the places that you can start if you want to start these learning improvement initiatives on your campus.
All right, thanks so much, Caroline. So yeah, where to start? What's the next step? So the last point that Caroline had was partnerships. And to me, that goes along with that collective will to improve. And so something I'm always on the hunt for is to talk with people in particular programs and start to get a sense of what would actually move the faculty to get them interested in working on something. So something I've done quite a few times is I'll invite a formal or informal leader in a program, and we'll have a coffee, maybe even adult beverage, and we'll sit across from one another. I'll ask, when you talk with your colleagues and you talk about students who are about ready to graduate, is there anything that you focus on to say, gosh, I wish they were a little bit better at this because it would help them maybe get into graduate school or help them get a better job? It's just something that would help them be more successful in the next phase of life, whatever that is. And they're like, Keston, should we look at the past assessment results? Yeah, sure. You might have past assessment results, but just even broader than that, what do you all talk about? And it is amazing what comes up. Sometimes you're like, yeah, the students, like writing might be something that, hey, they're just not writing as well as we would hope they would. And does that bother you and your faculty? Yeah. Like if you had the right structure, would you be willing to work on that for a little bit? And if this person is really attuned with sort of the political nature of the faculty, how they get along, it's like, yeah, I think so. If we're given the space and time, I think this is the kind of thing that we would work really hard to do to help out students. And so it's just, to me, it's really interesting to work with faculty, to think about those partnerships ahead of time to see what would excite them. And the second step is, well, it's a pretty long road actually to learning improvement. And this is the roadmap that I wish I had, and that's of course our book. So that's step number 2. Check out the book and see if it helps you out. We also think that the book is much better, it's much more fun if you get it with other people and you talk about it, maybe go through the exercises too. So again, we take step by step each of the processes you would need for learning improvement at scale. All right. So at this time, this is both Caroline and me. Throw us whatever questions that you have at this time. Caroline in particular loves really, really tough questions. So just put them in the chat box. We can't wait to see what they are. All right, people are pondering. Oh, good one. All right. Megan Good, co-author of Way Pig, Feed Pig, Way Pig, has a great question. Does the outcome of choice have to be an old one, or could it be a new one? Caroline, you want to take that one on?
Sure. So as I was kind of responding to this question in my head, I was thinking about the project that I mentioned a couple of times that I'm working on with our first year writing program. So we're focusing on rhetorical awareness. That's not something that was explicitly in their objectives. And in fact, as they were kind of going through the process of learning about learning improvement, they started to reflect a little bit on their objectives and think, well, maybe we actually need to change our objectives because it doesn't seem like they're actually focusing on the kinds of things that we think are important for this course. So in the process of learning about learning improvement and thinking about how that might apply, they ended up with kind of a different perspective on some of their objectives. And so we ended up creating some new objectives for that learning improvement initiative that they thought better reflected where they wanted the course to go. And so it didn't have to be an old one. It was kind of based on some ideas that were present in their old objectives, but by kind of refining what they wanted out of their student learning, it led them to, okay, maybe these objectives are a more reasonable way to talk about what we want our students to learn. So no, it can be new.
Great. I'm going to take well, there's one really tough question. I'm going to put this in the form of a question, Monica. Should we ask AALHE to have your book for its summer 22 book club? Well, let me think about that for a minute. I say the answer is yes to that one. So great question, Monica. Thank you so much. Next question. Can you use your steps in one program, or does it have to be school-wide? Aaron, when we wrote the book, the most specifically is toward an academic degree program, actually. But the same principles could be applied at the college level or like a general education level, which is an order of magnitude more difficult, but the same principles would apply. And by the way, recently I've been working with a community college and doing an opening workshop for them in just a few weeks. And a question came to me, said, hey, Keston, there's some of our faculty who really right now, even if they focused on their own section or thinking about the teaching of it, like that would be good for them to think about learning improvement. So not at the program level. So even though we focus on scale, I thought about it and thought, well, if you think about those 6 steps, I think it could apply to any particular level, although, program most specifically. So for an individual person, like the collective will to improve, it's like, look in the mirror there. You're like, are you willing to improve your section, right? And then you have to think about the other one. You still have to have a good vision about what you want students to learn. You still should think about the learning environment. You still need to think about interventions. You still need to think about implementation, and you still need to think about reassessment. So our sweetest spot is at the academic degree program, but most of the principles apply to lower levels and higher levels. And I would say too, with just a little imagination, it could be applied to student affairs programs as well. All right, Caroline, you want to take this one? This is actually a legit hard one.
It is a hard question. Yeah, so I mean, what I'll say is it depends on the context, right? So if we think, for example, that there is reason to expect that our cohorts are different, then we might want to collect information about the baseline similarities of those cohorts. And there's a bunch of different ways that we can do that. So for example, right now, one of the things that I'm doing in the learning improvement project that I'm working on is I collected data about students' skills in the domain that we're trying to improve at the beginning of the semester, as well as at the end of the semester, because I'm working with students who are first-year students in the time of COVID. So I know that they probably baseline aren't quite the same from semester to semester because they've been impacted differently in terms of their high school education, kind of wrapping up under COVID, online education being kind of the platform of choice last year here, back in person this year. So that can often be another thing that we need to think about, but whether or not that's a reasonable threat to the validity of our inferences is going to depend on our context, right? So that's one thing that I will say is often important for us to think about as well.
All right. Let's see, I'll take the next one. And this is from Kathy. And she says, what strategies do you recommend for finding out whether a program has a critical mass of people interested in improvement? Kathy, that's a great question. And actually worked with a faculty developer back in the day who helped me really think through that process. It's Carol Herney. She's now up at Colby College. And the idea is like, well, how do you get people interested in an improvement project? Can we just like appoint them and like, you program are going to improve? And we're like, that's kind of a weak in terms of finding out what people's heart and minds are in the improvement process. So we came up with a request for proposals, and that is the program had to put basically an RFP in to suggest that they were ready for an improvement initiative. one of those parts was the program had to say, well, these are the courses that we're thinking about modifying for this improvement effort. And here is every single faculty member who teaches in those courses. They each had to sign their name to the RFP, showing us that they were willing, as long as we gave them the space of the time, they were willing to work on that improvement effort. So that was one way that we sort of addressed that issue of collective will to improve. Let's see. I want to take, shall I take Sandra's and then maybe you can take Monica's, Caroline? So Sandra McGuire says, have you seen any initiatives that involve the collaboration between the Faculty Development Center and the Learning Center to improve student learning? I haven't seen that yet, although we've talked about that quite a bit on campus. In fact, there's a time where I, as the director of the assessment office and the head of our educational development office and the head of the learning centers were meeting, over coffee just to talk about ideas. This was right before COVID and COVID struck, so we didn't have a chance to do it. But I think there's some interesting opportunities there because I think learning centers could provide sort of a level of support. It has a lot of tools that might be brought into that process. So if you are involved with the learning center, I would love to hear some ideas about how that might be done. I think that's a great area for exploration.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big fan of learning centers. I worked in a learning center all through my time in college, and I think they have such wonderful potential for supporting projects like this. So Monica's question, so have you seen any patterns in the types of interventions that have led to learning improvement across projects? So this is a really great question, because I think from what I've seen in the projects that I've been privy to, there's a really wide array. Again, so it depends on what the construct is that you're trying to improve, what's going to work for it. But I think that idea of increased opportunity to learn, as well as opportunity to learn that is specifically targeted at the kind of learning that's addressed by the objective, is really important. So not just are we covering this content, but if I want students to be able to describe something or apply something or explain how something works, then if I'm just lecturing about that thing, it's probably not going to be sufficient to meet my objective. But if I start thinking about that from a learning improvement lens and think about, okay, well, if I want students to be able to complete a rhetorical analysis, for example, then I need to have them practice doing that kind of analysis, and I need to be able to give them feedback on those things. So not just opportunity to learn, but opportunity to learn that is relevant to the particular kinds of processes that you want to improve.
All right, Caroline. Sandra McGuire says the University of Rhode Island is doing this. I think this is the learning centers combined with maybe faculty development centers for learning improvement. So by the way, this is a shout to AALHE, which is happening in Rhode Island next summer. So perhaps we can reach out to Rhode Island and see what they're doing there. I'd love to hear more about that. Hey, Caroline, this is probably a good time to go to some other resources here. Thanks everybody for the great questions, by the way. Really appreciate that.
Sorry, my screen freaked out for a second there.
Okay. Calm down, screen. We got important things to tell you all. So there's a few additional resources. So if you're looking for the introduction to learning improvement, Weigh Pig, Feed Pig, Weigh Pig, you can access this by Googling Keston and Pig. The first thing will show up will be that article. Caroline, what else do we have? Oh, great. Sandra has put that URL in there. Caroline, if you can capture that too, so we can look at it a little bit later. Another thing, huge shout out to the learning improvement community. I see so many of my friends who are part of the learning improvement community who are here now. So they've got a great website. Monica Stittberg has been leading this effort for about a year and a half or so, maybe a little bit longer than that. And great resources and stories about learning improvement. In fact, we also have some tenets for learning improvement too. So we think about learning improvement, what are we talking about? So that's a great resource. It's a fresh community with awesome ideas. So come check us out. Also, we have the Assessment Institute that's happening really soon and later on in October 24th through 27th. And we do have a learning improvement track. In fact, I'm the chair of that track. So come by, check it out. IUPUI is at $100. It's not $10 registration this year. It's $0. It's completely virtual. So check us out. Check out the our area on learning improvement. And Caroline, what else we have? Oh my goodness. And I'm shameless promoter. You check it out and look at this beautiful cover that was designed by a stylist. And if you look really closely, I'm not going to tell you where, but there's actually a little pig on this cover somewhere too. So we try to integrate everything. All right. I think for this part, we are done. Iris, take us away.
Yes, I have just dropped the book link in the chat. I encourage everyone to check it out. I've got my copy handy as always. So thank you to Keston and Caroline for sharing your time and presenting with us today. And also thank you everyone so much. The chat was just so lively, and we all love when that happens. So yeah, if you're interested in ordering their book, Improving Student Learning at Scale, we have a discount code for you all for joining us today on Zoom. That is ISLE20 to get 20% off the book and free shipping. And like I said, I dropped the link in the chat. And like I said at the top of the webinar, the replay will be available next week and shared on all of our social media feeds. So if you have any feedback on this webinar or any requests for future webinars, please feel free to email us directly at stylustinfo@styluspub.com. And thanks again, everyone, and have a great afternoon.